Welcome to Serial Labyrinths, the channel where we explore the twisted paths of serial killers and the most chilling true crime stories from around the world. I'm your host, Alberto Lopez. Tonight we're stepping into a story that hits different because it's so recent and because the man at the center of it looked like any other guy you might pass on the street. This isn't some shadowy figure from decades ago who vanished into legend. This is a confessed serial killer who lived a long life after his crimes, blending right back into everyday existence until the weight of what he'd done finally caught up with him. Picture Portland, Oregon in the 1970s. The city still had that gritty Pacific Northwest edge. Rain-soaked streets, thick evergreen forests pressing in from every side, and working-class neighborhoods where people kept to themselves but still waved at their neighbors. It wasn't a polished tech hub it would become later. It was a place where factory workers, bartenders, and young people trying to find their footing moved through life with a certain toughness. And it was in this setting that 3 women would disappear in ways that left their families shattered for decades. Start with Marlene Claire Carlson. She was 44 years old in 1975, a mother with a warm presence and a life that revolved around the people she cared about. Marlene was living in the Portland area, doing her best to navigate the everyday struggles that so many faced back then. One day she was simply there, part of the rhythm of the city, and then she wasn't. Her absence left a hole that never really closed for those who loved her. From her perspective, it was probably just another ordinary stretch of days filled with the small routines that make up a life. Conversations, responsibilities, hopes for the future. She had no idea that someone had chosen her as prey. Then, 2 years later in 1977, 15-year-old Julie Marie Bennett vanished. Julie was still a kid in so many ways, full of that teenage energy and the dreams that come with it. She had friends, family, and the kind of bright future that gets stolen too early. Last seen in the Portland metro area, her case went cold for decades, leaving her loved ones in that agonizing limbo between hope and despair. Imagine the quiet dinners where her chair sat empty, the birthdays that passed without her, the way her family kept searching long after the official efforts slowed down. The thing is, these cases didn't immediately scream serial killer to everyone at the time. They were tragic, yes, but Portland had its share of violence and missing persons like any big city. People moved on with their lives while the rain kept falling and the city kept breathing. But someone knew the truth. Someone who had looked these women in the eyes and decided their lives didn't matter. Fast forward more than 15 years to 1993. Neeleen Loribel Doll, 33 years old, became the 3rd known victim. She was a woman trying to make it through her 30s, dealing with whatever challenges life had thrown her way. Like the others, she vanished from the Portland area under circumstances that would later tie her directly to the same hands. 3 women, 3 different decades, the same predator moving through the shadows while the rest of the world went about its business. The killer in this story wasn't some wild-eyed monster living off the grid. He was Jesse Andre DeBreeze, also known as Jeffrey Paul Cutlip. For years he walked free, even after taking those lives. He eventually moved away, living in places like Texas, building a life that looked normal on the surface. Neighbors probably never suspected a thing. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't obviously terrifying. He was just there. Until one day in 2012, something inside him cracked or shifted, and he picked up the phone. That phone call changed everything. From a town in Texas, he contacted Portland police and confessed to the murders. He gave details only the killer could know. The cases that had gone cold for so long suddenly had a name attached. Investigations that had gathered dust came roaring back to life. Families who had waited decades finally heard words they never thought they'd hear. We know who did this. But even with the confession, the full weight of what he'd done settled slowly. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life without parole. 3 consecutive life terms for the 3 women whose lives he ended. For a while, he sat in an Oregon prison, a man in his 70s, carrying the knowledge of what he had taken from the world. And then, just days ago, on March 29th, 2026, Jesse Andre DeBreeze died in custody while receiving hospice care. He was 76 years old. The man who had confessed to destroying 3 families finally left this earth. This story isn't about a manhunt that spanned continents or dramatic courtroom battles. It's quieter than that, and in some ways, more disturbing because of it. It's about how someone could commit such horrific acts and then simply keep living, breathing the same air as the people he hurt, until guilt or age or both finally caught up. We're only at the beginning here. The more we peel back the layers on this man's life and the women he targeted, the more unsettling the picture becomes. And as that quiet confession from a man living far away in Texas finally brought names to these long-forgotten cases, it's worth slowing down and really sitting with who these women actually were before their lives were stolen. Because these weren't just entries in a police file. They were real people with favorite songs, inside jokes, morning routines, and futures that got erased in the blink of an eye. Let's start with Marlene Claire Carlson in 1975. She was 44 years old, a mother who had already navigated plenty of life's harder chapters, but still showed up every single day with a quiet kind of strength. Portland back then was a working-class city wrapped in perpetual gray skies and the constant smell of wet pine and diesel from the trucks rolling through. Marlene lived in a modest apartment building where the hallways smelled like coffee and cigarettes, and neighbors could hear each other through the thin walls. She had that warm presence that made people feel comfortable around her. Friends remember her laugh, the kind that started soft and built into something that filled the room. She cooked simple meals for her kids, kept a clean house despite long work hours, and carried the kind of everyday resilience so many women of that era had to master. One ordinary afternoon, she was going about her life in that building, and then she was gone, strangled in her own home. The place where she should have been safest became the last place she ever saw. From her perspective, it probably felt like just another normal day in Portland. Maybe she was thinking about what to make for dinner, or worrying about bills, or smiling at a neighbor on the stairs. She had no idea that someone living under the same roof had already marked her. The rain was likely tapping against the windows that evening, the way it always does in the Pacific Northwest, turning the streets into dark mirrors. And then everything went silent. 2 years later, in 1977, the shadow moved again, this time taking someone much younger. Julie Marie Bennett was only 15 years old, still very much a girl caught between childhood and whatever came next. She lived in the Milwaukee area, just outside central Portland, where the neighborhoods give way to thicker trees and slower roads. Julie had that bright teenage energy mixed with the vulnerability that comes with being 15. She loved music, spent time with friends, and was still figuring out who she wanted to become. Picture her walking home after school or hanging out near Johnson Creek, that slow-moving stream surrounded by thick woods and blackberry bushes that grow wild along the banks. The area feels peaceful, almost gentle, until you realize how easily someone could disappear between those trees without anyone hearing a thing. Her family remembers her as someone full of potential. She had dreams, crushes, favorite outfits, and that unmistakable teenage laugh that echoes through a house. On the day she vanished, she was doing something completely ordinary, the kind of thing teenagers do hundreds of times without thinking twice. She never came home. Her absence tore through her family like a slow earthquake. Her parents would sit at the kitchen table at night, staring at the empty chair where she used to eat cereal and talk about her day. Her siblings grew up with a ghost in the family photos. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went, and every year the pain aged right along with them.
The thing is, Portland in the late 70s wasn't some lawless place, but it was a city where people still trusted their neighbors and didn't always lock their doors. Young girls like Julie could walk short distances alone. The forests and creeks that surrounded the suburbs felt like part of the natural playground, not places where monsters waited. But that trust became a deadly blind spot. Then came 1993. By this point, nearly 20 years had passed since the first killing. Neeleen Lorabelle Dahl was 33 years old, a woman in the prime of her life who deserved decades more than she got. She was navigating her 30s in the Portland area, dealing with the same everyday struggles so many people face: work, relationships, trying to build something stable. Neeleen had her own circle of friends, her own small routines that made her days feel meaningful. She was a real person with favorite coffee shops, go-to songs on the radio, and moments of laughter that her loved ones still remember clearly. When she vanished, it wasn't front-page news for long. Another woman swallowed by the city and the dense, rainy landscape around it. Imagine the communities these women moved through. In the 1970s and 80s, Portland still had that blue-collar soul. Lumber mills, factories, and neighborhoods where everyone knew someone's cousin or worked with someone's brother. Missing posters would go up on telephone poles and laundromat bulletin boards, only to fade and tear in the constant rain. Families organized their own searches, walking the same wooded trails and creek beds with flashlights, calling out names that never answered back. The police investigated, but resources were limited, and connections between the cases weren't immediately obvious. Life moved forward. New families moved into the apartments. Kids kept playing near Johnson Creek. The city kept breathing, while 3 separate holes grew deeper in 3 separate families. Picture the small, devastating details that stayed with the people left behind. Marlene's favorite mug still sitting in her kitchen cupboard. Julie's school books never collected from her locker. Neeleen's unfinished plans and half-written letters. The way holidays became landmines of grief instead of celebrations. Mothers who stopped setting an extra place at the table but never stopped thinking about it. Fathers who aged overnight, carrying a rage and sadness they couldn't put down. Siblings who had to explain to their own children why there was a photo on the wall of an aunt or sister they would never meet. The Pacific Northwest rain became almost symbolic in these stories, steady, relentless, washing away evidence while the pain soaked deeper into the families. The woods and creeks that make Oregon so beautiful also became perfect hiding places. Dense undergrowth, muddy trails that erase footprints, areas where screams could be swallowed by the trees and the sound of water. For decades, these 3 cases sat cold
and mostly disconnected in the public eye. Different years, different circumstances on the surface, but the same predator moving silently through the same region, taking what he wanted and then stepping back into ordinary life as if nothing had happened. The women's families learned to carry their grief privately, smiling through conversations when people asked if there was any news, all while knowing deep down that the answers might never come. This long silence, these ordinary lives interrupted so violently, makes what happened years later feel even heavier. Because when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't arrive with sirens or dramatic headlines. It arrived with a single phone call from a man who had already lived most of his life after destroying 3 others. He didn't look like a monster. That's what makes this part of the story burrow so deep under your skin and stay there. Jeffrey Paul Cutlip was born on June 15, 1949, and by his mid-20s, he was already living in downtown Portland, Oregon, in the kind of modest apartment building where people's lives overlapped whether they wanted them to or not. Thin walls, shared hallways that smelled like damp carpet and old cooking oil, and neighbors who nodded at each other on the way to check their mail. Cutlip blended in perfectly. He was just another guy in his 20s trying to get by in a gray, rainy city surrounded by endless evergreen forests. In 1975, he lived in the same building as Marlene Claire Carlson at 715 Southwest 15th Avenue. Same hallways, same stairs, same everyday rhythm of coming and going. Marlene was 44, a divorced mother of 3, doing her best to rebuild after life had thrown its hardest punches. She had that warm, resilient presence that made people feel seen. Cutlip wasn't some stranger from across town. He was the guy who lived down the hall. He knew her schedule, her routines, the sound of her door opening and closing. It was July 30th. Cutlip was 26 years old, living in an apartment building in downtown Portland. One of his neighbors was a 44-year-old divorced mom named Marlene Claire Carlson. She had 3 kids. That night, her apartment door happened to be unlocked. Cutlip noticed. He slipped inside. Marlene was asleep in her bed. Without saying a word, he jumped on her and demanded sex. When she refused, he tried to smother her with a pillow. It didn't work fast enough. So he grabbed the telephone cord next to the bed, wrapped it around her neck, and strangled her until she stopped moving. Then he assaulted her body. He left her right there in the bed. Marlene wasn't found until August 7th, almost a full week later. Cutlip lived at the end of the same hallway. His name was even listed in the police file as one of the tenants. But guess what? Nobody ever questioned him. Not once. He just walked away. Imagine that for a moment. Every time he stepped out his front door, he was surrounded by the aftermath of what he had done. The police investigation, the whispers in the hallway, the pain radiating from the people who loved her. And yet, he stayed. He didn't pack up and run. He simply kept existing in that building like nothing had happened. The rain kept falling on Portland streets, turning everything into a glossy reflection, while Cutlip carried on with his days. Now here's where it gets really dark. 2 years later, in April 1977, he struck again. This time it was a 15-year-old girl named Julie Marie Bennett. She was hanging out at Johnson Creek Park in Milwaukee with some friends. Cutlip met her there. They talked, walked to a little store called Corner Pantry, bought some beer and cigarettes. He sweet-talked her into going back to his place with him. Once they were inside, things turned ugly real fast. He overpowered the girl and the attack began. He assaulted her for nearly 2 hours.
When Julie threatened to call the police, he panicked. He took her back toward the park and tried to suffocate her. When that didn't work, he dragged her to the creek, pushed her head underwater, and held her there until she drowned. He dragged her body to the east side of the creek and left her. 2 days later, they found Julie face down in the water. At first, police thought it was just an accidental drowning. Her family and friends, though, they always suspected Cutlip. The whispers got so loud that he eventually moved out of the neighborhood because people were looking at him funny. Still, no arrest. By this point, he had already claimed 2 victims across just a couple of years. Yet there was no manhunt with his name on it. No one connected the dots strongly enough to pull him in. He worked jobs, interacted with people, and existed in the same Pacific Northwest landscape where the rain never seemed to stop and the forests always felt like they were watching. The thing is, Cutlip wasn't flashy or obviously unstable in a way that drew attention. He was the kind of man who could fade into the background of any room. Average build, unremarkable face, the sort of person you might pass on the sidewalk and forget 10 seconds later. That ordinary appearance became his best disguise. While families were searching wooded trails with flashlights and hanging faded missing posters on telephone poles, he was simply there, living, breathing, waiting. Fast forward to 1982. Cutlip broke into a woman's house, tied her up, and assaulted her for hours. This time they caught him. He was convicted and labeled a sex offender. He went to prison. But predators like this, they don't stay locked up forever. He got out on parole, and in 1993, just 7 months after being released, he killed again. On July 21st, he met Neeleen Lorabelle Dahl, a 33-year-old woman from Spokane who was visiting Portland. They hooked up at a bar, did some drugs together, and ended up back at his place. Cutlip wanted to tie her up. She said no. They fought. He strangled her until she was unconscious and then tried to assault her body. He stuffed her into the trunk of her own car, drove to a remote spot off Southeast Bull Run Road near Sandy, dumped the body, and left the car in a Fred Meyer parking lot. A jogger found Neeleen the same day. After that, Cutlip didn't get caught for the killing right away, but he did get arrested for robbing 2 people at gunpoint. 3 murders, 3 different decades, the same hands responsible. After that, something shifted. Cutlip eventually left Oregon. He made his way down to Texas, settling in Brownsville near the Mexican border. That's where he lived for years under the name Jesse Andre DeBreeze. He changed his identity like someone changing clothes. Neighbors in Brownsville saw him as just another older guy going about his quiet business. He wasn't throwing wild parties or drawing suspicion. He was unremarkable. He shopped at the same grocery stores, walked the same streets, and went home to whatever modest place he called his own. While the families back in Portland were still marking empty birthdays and wondering what happened to their daughter, sister, or mother, the man who destroyed those lives was thousands of miles away, aging quietly under a different name in the Texas heat. Picture the contrast. Portland's constant drizzle and deep green forests versus the dry, dusty border town where he reinvented himself. He had successfully built what looked like a normal existence after committing horrors that shattered 3 families forever. No dramatic escape, no underground network helping him hide. He simply walked away, changed his name, and kept living while the people he hurt carried wounds that never closed. But here's what's so unsettling about men like this. The mask doesn't always stay perfect forever. Whether it was guilt eating away at him,
the fear of dying with his sins unspoken, or just the simple weight of old age creeping in, something finally broke inside Jesse Andre DeBreeze. In July 2012, from his home in Brownsville, Texas, he picked up the phone and called the police back in Portland. He confessed. He gave specifics only the killer could possibly know. And just like that, after nearly 4 decades for the first murder, the double life that had protected him for so long began to crumble. This wasn't the story of a cunning criminal genius constantly evading capture through brilliant schemes. It was the story of an average, predatory man who killed when the opportunity presented itself, then simply chose to keep walking forward like nothing had happened. He lived among his victims' communities, then lived far away under a new name, all while the rain kept falling on Portland and the families kept waiting. The ordinary nature of his existence after the killings makes the whole story feel heavier. Because if someone like Jeffrey Paul Cutlip, later Jesse Andre DeBreeze, could do what he did and then blend back into everyday life so completely, it forces you to wonder how many other ordinary faces might be hiding something just as dark. In July 2012, from a modest home in Brownsville, Texas, a 63-year-old man picked up the phone and changed everything. Jesse Andre DeBreeze, the man who had spent most of his adult life as Jeffrey Paul Cutlip, dialed the Portland Police Bureau and asked to speak to a detective. When the call was transferred, he didn't waste time with small talk. He started talking about murders that had gone unsolved for decades. He spoke calmly, almost matter-of-factly, describing exactly how he had strangled Marlene Claire Carlson in her Portland apartment in 1975. He remembered the layout of the building, the color of the walls, the way she had struggled, and where her body had been left. He gave details that had never been released to the public.
The detective on the other end listened carefully, taking notes, trying to keep his voice steady. At first, it sounded like another crank call. Portland got plenty of those on old, cold cases. But the more the man talked, the more the detective realized this was different. The caller knew things only the killer could know. When he moved on to Julie Marie Bennett's murder in 1977, describing the exact spot along Johnson Creek where her body had been found face down in the water, the room in Portland went quiet. By the time he started detailing Neeleen Lorabelle Dahl's killing in 1993, detectives were already booking flights to Texas. What they didn't know was that this phone call had been building inside the man for years. Whether it was guilt, fear of dying with his secrets, or simply the weight of old age pressing down on him, something had finally broken. He wanted to talk, and once he started, he didn't hold back. Portland investigators flew down to Brownsville and sat across from him in an interview room. For hours, they listened as Jesse Andre DeBreeze laid out the truth. He described the sexual assaults. He explained how he had chosen each woman. He talked about the disposal of the bodies with a cold precision that made experienced detectives shift uncomfortably in their seats. Every fact checked out against the old case files. There was no doubt left. The quiet neighbor from 1975, the man who had slipped through the cracks for nearly 40 years, was finally confessing to all 3 murders. Back in Portland, the news hit the victims' families like a slow-moving freight train. Some relatives had almost given up hope of ever knowing what happened. Others had spent decades carrying a quiet rage mixed with crushing sadness. Now they were being told that the man responsible had been living freely in Texas under a different name the entire time. The emotional whiplash was brutal. Marlene's children, now adults in their 50s and 60s, had to process that the man who killed their mother had been walking around free while they raised their own families. Julie's parents, who had lost their 15-year-old daughter, finally had confirmation of what they had feared for 35 years. Neeline's loved ones received answers after 19 long years of wondering. The thing is, knowing the truth didn't magically heal anything. It just gave the pain a specific face and a name. Families now had to prepare themselves to stand in the same courtroom as the man who had destroyed their worlds. In 2013, Jesse Andre DeBreeze was extradited back to Oregon. He stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to 3 counts of aggravated murder. There was no long, drawn-out trial, no dramatic courtroom battle. He simply accepted responsibility. During the sentencing hearing, family members were finally given the chance to speak directly to him. One after another, they stood up and read statements that had been decades in the making. A relative of Marlene's described how her murder had shattered their family, how holidays were never the same, how her grandchildren grew up never knowing their grandmother's laugh. Julie's family spoke about the teenage girl who never got to graduate, never got to fall in love, never got to become the woman she was meant to be. They talked about the empty chair at every family gathering for 36 years. Neeline's loved ones spoke of the vibrant 33-year-old woman who had been taken just as life was supposed to get better. Their words were raw, angry, exhausted, and heartbreaking all at once. DeBreeze sat there quietly through all of it. Some observers said he showed little visible emotion. Others thought they saw the weight of everything finally pressing down on the old man. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. At his age, it meant he would die in prison. As the judge read the sentence, the families finally heard the words they had waited lifetimes to hear: guilty. But even after the gavel came down, the reality felt hollow for many. Justice had arrived decades too late. The man who had taken everything from them had already lived most of a full life. He had seen parts of the country they never got to show their loved ones. He had breathed free air while their daughters, mothers, and sisters lay in the ground. The confessions gave answers. The courtroom gave accountability, but nothing could give back the stolen years. After sentencing, DeBreeze was processed into the Oregon prison system. The man who had once blended so perfectly into everyday life now wore prison clothes and lived by someone else's schedule. For the next 13 years, he existed behind bars, aging, declining, watching the world continue without him. The families tried to move forward, but the scars ran too deep to ever fully disappear. This courtroom chapter closed one long nightmare, but it opened new questions about how many other monsters might still be walking free, carrying secrets they haven't confessed yet. And for the families, it marked the beginning of learning how to live with answers that came far too late. After the heavy courtroom doors closed in 2013, and the judge's gavel had delivered 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, Jesse Andre DeBreeze vanished from the outside world in the most ordinary way possible. He was processed into the Oregon Department of Corrections system and sent to live out the rest of his days behind concrete walls and razor wire. The man who had once walked freely through Portland neighborhoods and later the dusty streets of Brownsville, Texas, now woke up every morning to the same metallic clang of cell doors, the same counted meals, and the same gray routine that thousands of other inmates knew too well. By then, he was already in his 60s, and time moved differently inside. The decades he had stolen from Marlene, Julie, and Neeline now seemed to press down on him with quiet vengeance. He aged rapidly in that environment. His hair thinned and turned completely white. His once unremarkable frame grew frail and stooped. Prison medical records show he developed multiple serious health problems, heart issues, diabetes, and the slow erosion that comes with old age, combined with a lifetime of whatever private demons he carried. For 13 long years he existed in that suspended state, neither fully alive in the way free people understand, nor yet gone. He spent his days in a cell, sometimes reading, sometimes staring at the wall, carrying the knowledge of what he had done, while the world outside kept turning. Meanwhile, the families he had shattered were still trying to figure out how to live with the answers they had waited most of their lives to receive. Marlene's children, now grandparents themselves, would sit at kitchen tables in Portland suburbs and talk about how strange it felt knowing their mother's killer was still breathing, even if he was locked away. Julie's siblings, who had been children when she was taken at 15, found themselves explaining to their own grown kids why there was always an empty space in family stories. Neeline's loved ones marked another quiet anniversary each year, the pain softened only slightly by the knowledge that justice, however late and imperfect, had finally been served. Then, in early 2026, his health collapsed. Prison doctors determined there was nothing more they could do except make him comfortable. He was moved into hospice care inside the correctional medical facility. The man who had once taken life so coldly now lay in a narrow hospital-style bed, hooked up to monitors and oxygen, surrounded by the impersonal beige walls and humming machines of the state. Guards still watched him, but the threat he once posed had long since faded into frailty. He was 76 years old, dying slowly in the same system that had finally named him for what he was. On March 29, 2026, just a few days ago, Jesse Andre DeBreeze took his last breath. The news came quietly at first, a brief statement from the Oregon Department of Corrections confirming that the convicted triple murderer had died while receiving hospice care. No dramatic final words, no tearful confession on his deathbed. He simply slipped away in the early morning hours, and with him went whatever remaining secrets he had never chosen to share. Picture the scenes in Portland area homes on March 29th and 30th. Quiet phone calls between siblings. Tears in living rooms where old photographs still hung on the walls. Some families lit candles. Others simply sat together without speaking much, letting the finality wash over them. The rain that had fallen so relentlessly on this story for 5 decades was falling again that week, tapping against windows as if the city itself remembered. From his perspective in those final hours, no one will ever truly know what moved through his mind. Did he see the faces of the 3 women he killed? Did he feel anything resembling remorse, or had that part of him died long ago? Or was it simply the tired confusion of an old man whose body was finally shutting down? Those answers died with him on March 29th, and the families will have to live with that final silence too. His death closes one of the longest and quietest chapters in Portland's history of unsolved violence, but it doesn't erase the echoes. Those echoes still move through the streets where Marlene once walked, along the wooded banks of Johnson Creek where Julie was taken, and through the places where Neeline once lived her everyday life. The monster is gone, but the absence he created remains exactly the same size. And so the story of Jesse Andre DeBreeze comes to its final, quiet close. Not with the dramatic arrest so many true crime stories promise, not with a high-speed chase or a shocking courtroom reveal, but with the silent death of a frail 76-year-old man in a prison hospice bed on March 29, 2026.
The Pacific Northwest landscape itself played a silent role in this tragedy. Those dense, dripping forests and slow-moving creeks like Johnson Creek don't just hide bodies, they hide the truth. They swallow sound. They erase footprints. They make it easy for someone to do something terrible and then step back onto a normal street as if nothing happened. The same natural beauty that draws people to Oregon also protected the man who preyed on its most vulnerable residents. This case reminds us that some labyrinths don't have satisfying exits. Monsters don't always get caught because they're brilliant. Sometimes they get caught because they simply get old and tired of carrying the weight alone. And sometimes they never get caught at all. The rain is still falling on Portland tonight. It will keep falling long after we've all moved on to the next story. But somewhere in those gray streets and green forests, the echoes of Marlene, Julie, and Neeleen continue. Faint, persistent, and impossible to forget. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, hit the like button, and share for more raw global cases.